Good evening. My name is Brian Sweeney. As chair of the Getty Research Institute Council, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to tonight's lecture. The council consists of a group of donors who have become friends over their enjoyment of participating and learning about the amazingly varied projects of the GRI. For some years, we have funded important acquisitions of rare books and prints for the special collections. We have also followed with great interest how the scholarly initiatives of this great institution have increasingly moved into exploring not only the Western tradition, but the art history of other cultures. To support this new direction, we established this lecture series, which presents innovative approaches to understanding non-Western art and the encounter between cultures. Many of you may have attended last year's first lecture of this series given by Diana Magnoloni-Kerpel, who shared her fascinating research on the Florentine Codex, a 16th century Aztec manuscript illuminating and describing the Spanish conquest of Mexico. To further disseminate this groundbreaking research to a larger public, we supported the production of a small book. Although the lectures address scholarly topics, this series is intended to familiarize the public with a new area of research. You may acquire this wonderfully illustrated publication in the auditorium's entrance. We hope that you may be even inclined, as many of us were, to gift several copies of these books to your friends. From early colonial Mexico and Aztec culture, we move today to 18th century Japan. We are especially thrilled by Professor Lippit's kind offer to present his research because the GRI Council is traveling to Japan in 3 weeks. We will be guided by Professor Lippit's mentor, Professor Yoshi Shimizu, whom I would especially like to welcome to tonight's event. I am sure that you will be captivated by this lecture, and in the name of all the members of the Council, I invite all of you to the reception that will follow on the main patio at the GRI. I now turn over to Thomas, who will introduce Professor Lippit.
Good evening. My name is Thomas Gatkins, and I'm the director of the Getty Research Institute, and my first duty is to tell you what you do with your cell phone. You just put it on this red sign there on the side. Well, it is also my pleasure to welcome you for this really special event. However, I also have to thank the Council and the Chair, Brian Sweeney, for their generosity to support this event and the entire lecture series. We are so privileged that the members of this exceptional Council join us on an exciting scholarly excursions, always help and support new discoveries and innovative fields of research. My thanks go to the Council, but also to our very special guest today, Professor Yoshi Shimizu, Emeritus of Princeton University, who is not only the mentor of Professor Lippit, but also the mentor to most of the professors and curators teaching and exploring Japanese art in this country today. Yoshi, we are honored to receive your advice, and it will be a tremendous privilege to travel with you to Japan. Why don't you raise your arm so that everybody can see who you are? It is now my great delight to introduce our speaker, Yukio Lippit, professor at the Department of History of Art and Architecture at Harvard University. Having spent his formative years both in the US and Japan, Professor Lippit, to the envy of many of us, is truly a multicultural and multilingual scholar. Prior to his graduate study in art history, Professor Lippit had studied literature and criticism at Harvard, especially with Yves Bois, and in Paris. Early on, he recognized the one fundamental difference between literary studies and art history. The latter deals with art's materiality. As a graduate student, Professor Lippit astutely observed in his study of the early 12th century illustrated narrative hand scroll, The Tale of Genji, that through close and critical scrutiny of the scroll's images, coupled with the equally close reading of the accompanying narrative text, a newer and richer meaning of the scroll emerges. Realizing the differences between literary and visual art, he wisely chose art history for his future, which we very much could support. Throughout his many publications, Professor Lippit's sharp eye, his stimulated fresh ways of looking at masterpiece paintings, such as the triptych of ink paintings by the 13th century Chinese Zen monk painter Mu Chi. In his study for works of art, Professor Lippit, that's not my, I'm sorry, I brought that up, but I just pushed here out something. So it's not, but it goes well together, I think. In his study of works of art, Professor Lippit draws no artificial boundaries between academia and art museums. In 2012, he curated a spectacular exhibition of works of the 18th century Japanese painter Ito Yakucho at the National Gallery of Art in Washington and wrote the catalog. The exhibition, consisting of a set of 30 birds and flower paintings from the Imperial Household collection that are rarely seen in toto, even in Japan, attracted 236,000 viewers during the short exhibition period of just 4 weeks. In 2012, Professor Lippit's book, Painting of the Realm, the Kano House of Painters in 17th Century Japan, was awarded both the Charles Rufus Murray Book Award by the College Art Association and the John Whitney Hall Book Prize by the Association of Asian Studies. In 1213, his article in the Art Bulletin of Modes and Manners in Medieval Japanese Ink Paintings was awarded the Arthur Kingsley Porter Prize as the year's best article by the College Art Association. These awards recognize Professor Lippit not only as the most eminent scholar in Asian art history in recent years, but also in the overall discipline of art history, East or West. Well, most invaluable, Professor Lippit is a dedicated pianist. It is great fortune to the realm of art history that he has not chosen the career as a professional pianist. There are many reasons to ask you to join me in welcoming Professor Yukio Lippit.
Thank you very much. Chairman Sweeney, Director Getkins, thank you very much for the extremely generous introduction. It's a real privilege to be able to address the Getty community with a subject that is close to my heart. Zen art poses a conundrum. On the one hand, Zen Buddhism emphasizes the concept of emptiness, the emptiness of form, and by extension, the illusoriness of all phenomena in the world. On the other hand, over the centuries, a prodigious amount of artwork has been created in association with Zen thought and practice. A wide range of media, genres, expressive modes, and strategies of representation were embraced to convey in some way or another the idea of emptiness, and especially so in painting. Form was used to express the essence of formlessness. And this gave rise to a remarkable, wide-ranging tradition of artworks that essentially negated their own affect, resulting in a tradition of self-negating art. Two examples demonstrate the sheer range of profiles these artworks could assume. Zen portraiture, usually created for the mortuary rituals of prominent monks, were characterized by verisimilitude. Also, they were generally accompanied by inscriptions, such as the one you see at the top of this 14th century Japanese Zen portrait, that discursively negated its own realism, asserting that the likeness that you see here does not in any way capture the essence of its sitter. On the other hand, paintings from the 18th century by itinerant Japanese Zen monks used abbreviated brushwork and gestural abstraction to achieve the same ends, in this case in a depiction of Bodhidharma, the first Chinese patriarch of Zen. Now, one might say that it is this diversity and this inner mechanics of negation that constitute the richness and appeal of artworks associated with Zen Buddhism. There is one painting, however, that stands alone in this regard, a work whose rendering of its subject and complexity are sui generis within the Zen tradition. And it is this work, titled The Gourd and the Catfish, by the Zen monk painter Josetsu, that is the subject of this evening's lecture. Now in the collection of the Taizoin, which is a subtemple of a prominent Zen monastery in Kyoto, Myoshinji, the Gourd and the Catfish was painted around the year 1413 for the warrior ruler of Japan at the time, the shogun Ashikaga Yoshimochi. And it involved 31 of the leading Zen monks of Kyoto who left their verse inscriptions at the top of the scroll that you see here. Now, the rendering in this painting of a figure standing in a landscape was executed in the most innovative style of ink-based painting then being practiced in Japan, one that was referred to by contemporaries as the Shinyo, or new mode. Designated a national treasure in 1951, The Gourd and the Catfish is considered one of the most iconic works of Japanese Zen art today. Its subject matter seems straightforward enough. As stated in the preface that's inscribed on the work, a man on a bank, the one you see here, holds a large gourd in both hands, attempting to somehow capture or pin down the catfish swimming in the stream below. Now, this is clearly an impossible task, a nonsensical act. But this impossibility, as we shall see, is precisely the point. And indeed, numerous commentators in the modern era, ranging from the Japanese literary critic Kobayashi Hideo to the Zen popularist D.T. Suzuki to Andre Malraux, have extolled the ability of The Gourd and the Catfish to encapsulate pictorially the otherwise seemingly nonsensical, counterintuitive, and ineffable nature of Zen thought and practice. Now, despite the considerable commentary that has accrued around this work, many fundamental questions about its nature and meaning remain. Most of these questions center around the fact that the subject matter of The Gourd and the Catfish appears to be entirely without precedent, which is highly unusual in a tradition such as Zen Buddhism that is otherwise heavily genealogical and reliant upon authoritative historical examples. This question directly conditions how one experiences the tone or mood of the work, which could possibly be drawn from vernacular folkloric traditions. Is it serious or playful? Earnest or ludic? How and why was this particular subject chosen? And do the many inscriptions by Zen monks on its surface add up to any specific pattern of response or interpretation? Is there an overall interpretive disposition to the work? Unfortunately, I'm unable to answer these questions. But this evening, in my brief time at the podium, I will make a number of propositions concerning The Gourd and the Catfish that hope to clarify the ways in which we might conceptualize the work, and by extension, consider further the relationship between painting and Zen Buddhism in medieval Japan. Now, these propositions number 4 in all, and can briefly be described as follows. The first is the proposal that The Gourd and the Catfish should be understood as a Zen koan, that is to say, a story, an exemplary story that plays a role, an important role in Zen study and practice, but that the nature of this koan, as I hope to demonstrate, is not as straightforward as one might imagine. The second proposition is that the original format and setting of this painting, which was a two-sided standing screen in the reception room of the shogunal palace, is crucial to understanding how it was experienced by its initial audiences and how it constituted a performance of the Zen koan in question. The third proposition is that the new mode of landscape painting that's adopted here, based upon Chinese precedent, plays a significant role in staging its subject specifically at a moment of spiritual awakening. And the fourth and final proposition is that the gourd and the catfish embeds within its own formal qualities, within its morphology, a dialectical approach, a response, if you will, to its own query. Through these propositions, I hope to demonstrate that these qualities, these visual, pictorial qualities of the gourd and the catfish are inseparable from its pictorialization of a nonsensical Zen situation, or, if you will, its presentation of impossibility. By taking the form that it does, the painting not only serves as a ground for Zen discourse, but embeds and internalizes that discourse within the visual image itself. And in doing so, it embodied a new type of Zen painting, one that was incomparably more sophisticated than what had come before. Now, before entering into these four assertions or arguments or propositions that I just outlined, let me first introduce in greater detail the work itself. The painting is reasonably large-sized at 77 centimeters in height, some 2.5 feet, and some 113 centimeters across, which is almost 4 feet, consisting only of a few composite elements which are easily described. Most of the scene consists of a foreground that you see here with a stream winding through it from left to right, negotiating along the way several rock clusters before opening up into what seems to be a marshy, watery expanse, which is interrupted just by these sketchy stalks of reed. The composition is anchored in the lower left corner by 3 thin stalks of bamboo that, as you can see here, kind of bend and sway like seaweed in an aquarium. And one of them reaches out and canopies the protagonist of the work standing in the center, a male figure with unkempt hair and beard, dressed in peasant clothing. Now, this might be understood as a kind of East Asian trope for a country bumpkin, the proverbial rube who fell off the turnip truck. He is holding a gourd with both hands, and below him to the right is the catfish in question, swimming away in the stream. Behind the man looms a simple mountain range depicted in the so-called boneless manner, mokkotsubyō in Japanese, that is to say, without outline, indicating that the entire landscape is suffused in mist. And indeed, it appears that the surface is subtly inked in with a very light gradation of wash, taking advantage of the liquidity of ink painting to imbue the scene with atmosphere. The composition is engineered to focus attention on the figure situated in the lower middle, but at the same time it succeeds in generating an ambiguous, otherworldly ambiance with abundant use of empty space in a so-called one-corner composition with a minimum of motifs, conveying the sense that one is viewing a diorama in a natural history museum. The painting is accompanied by a preface authored by a certain Daigaku Shusu, a very prominent Zen monk of the time. And here you see the preface in the upper right corner by Shusu, who was an abbot of numerous monasteries throughout his career and a close religious advisor to the shogun Ashikaga Yoshimochi. In addition, poetic verses, all Chinese-style quatrains on the theme of the painting are inscribed by some 31 Zen monks, including Shusu, whose preface is here and ends with a poem, and each of these are poems by separate monks within the Kyoto Zen community. They were all prominent members of what was known as the 5 Mountains, named after the 5 major administrative temples in Kyoto of the Rinzai Zen sect. Now, although there's no date recorded anywhere for the work, based upon an analysis of the death dates of these inscribers, it's believed that the gourd and the catfish was painted sometime around the year 1413. Daigaku Shusu's preface informs us that Yoshimochi, the shogun, commissioned the work and entrusted its realization to the monk painter Josetsu, after which it was mounted as a screen to be set at the shogun's right-hand side. The preface also explains the subject matter as follows, and I'll just read what's on the screen here. That which soars high in the clouds can be caught with an arrow. That which swims in deep waters captured with a fishing net. This, after all, is the work of hunters and fishermen. But how is one to pin down in the muddy pool a catfish, smooth and slimy, using only a large empty gourd, itself slippery and round? Although the painting is traditionally understood as asking how one might catch a catfish with a gourd, as this translation suggests, it can also be understood as how one pins down a catfish. Whatever the case may be, a close look at the figure reveals his struggle with this improbable assignment. He holds the gourd awkwardly. It appears as if he is not so much grasping it as keeping it from floating up into the sky while taking the measure of the catfish below. His wide stance, hunched shoulders, the cock of his neck, and facial expression evince both determination and puzzlement at the same time. Now, the poems were solicited to provide responses to this situation by high-ranking monks, all of them accomplished litterateurs. And although time doesn't permit a full accounting of the 31 poems, I'm just going to read a few examples to convey the flavor of their responses to this scenario. For example, Shusu, the author of the preface, added his own poem on the problem at hand at the end of his preface, playfully suggesting that the challenge be rendered even more difficult. He writes, "With a lively touch of his hand, the gourd will capture a catfish. And should you seek an even greater sight, try it with a dash of oil." Other monks, such as Gyokuen Bonpo, envision a successful completion of the task and then playfully suggest a fish dinner, an ultimate act of transgression for a member of the Buddhist clergy, which was in theory vegetarian. He writes, "Pin its tail with a gourd, then turn it into catfish soup. And what should one do for rice? Cook sand. That should be nice." And finally, just to cite one more example, Sokuan Reichi compares the tireless catfish to the versifying monks themselves. He writes, "The monks are a lively bunch, flipping and flopping just like that creature, the catfish. If one day one of them should actually get pinned down, that'll be the day the frog transforms into a prince." This is a hortatory call to monks that they may undergo a transformation one day into an awakened being. In this way, many of the poems, while focusing on the elusiveness of the catfish, find various and sundry ways to respond to or interpret or extend the absurdity of this task. Now, one of the great mysteries concerning the catfish and the gourd concerns the origin and nature of this subject. And this is where I'd like to turn attention to the first of my propositions, mentioned earlier that this work actually constitutes a Zen koan. The query put forth in Daigaku Shusu's preface, whether a catfish can be captured with a gourd, does not actually appear in the considerable recorded koan literature that had accrued by this time, by the 15th century. Because this subject has no precedent, some commentators have cast doubt as to whether this is actually a depiction of a Zen koan. But in order to understand the importance of this assertion, it is necessary to say a few words about the genre of the koan. Koan, or the Chinese word from which the Japanese word is derived, gungan, literally means public case and constituted stories and dialogues by famous Zen monks of the past to serve as case studies of enlightened thought for Zen practitioners. The overwhelming majority of koan consisted of sequences of dialogue that resulted in surprising and inscrutable acts by a renowned monk, which would then serve as the focus of meditation in Zen study or as a way of judging a practitioner's progress, testing their ability to transcend normalizing dualistic thought. Indeed, many famous monks achieved their first satori, or awakening, by struggling with and finally conceiving of a response to a koan assigned by their master. In the popular literature, koan have tended to be represented in overly simplistic terms as seemingly illogical or non sequitur riddles, among the most famous of these being the phrase, "What is the sound of one hand clapping?" But most koan were more like the following example, which is titled "Nanchuan Kills a Kitten," which I'll read just to give you a sense of the tenor of a very celebrated koan in the Zen tradition. It reads, "One day, Master Nanchuan found the monks of the eastern and western halls quarreling over a kitten. So right then he snatched it up and proclaimed, 'If any of you manage to speak up, the kitten lives. But if you don't know what to say, it's dead.' The monks had no response, so Nanchuan slew it. That evening, his disciple, Zhao Zhou, returned to the monastery. Nanchuan described the incident to him, at which point Zhao Zhou took off his shoe and placing it carefully upon his head, left the room. Nanchuan said, "If you had been there, it would have saved the kitten." Pretty straightforward stuff. Needless to say, Zhao Zhou's slaying of the kitten here is cruel and outrageous. But the shock value is precisely the point. Koan were often instructive because they forced practitioners to consider extreme or anomalous acts of behavior. As the religious historian Robert Scharf writes, a Zen or Chan, the Chinese word for Zen, case embodied not so much a position on a contested point, but rather a dialectical technique for dealing with existential issues of immediate import in Buddhist practice, such as causation, enlightenment, truth, and death. Over time, koans such as these were collected in anthologies that circulated widely among East Asian Zen communities, and the two most influential in Japan were titled The Gateless Barrier, in Japanese Mumonkan, and Blue Cliff Record, or Hikigandoku. Each of the koan contained therein accrued their own commentary, which became in many cases an equally important part of the literature, a source for study and allusion by later students. What renders the scene pictorialized in the Gourd and the Catfish difficult to assess is that although it appears similar in tone and disposition to a koan, it does not in fact appear in any of these anthologies, and for that matter, it has not been recorded anywhere. As a Zen problem, it is unique. Now, this uniqueness has led some commentators, most notably the art historian Shimao Arata, to argue that the subject matter is in fact drawn from popular sources, such as the considerable folklore surrounding the catfish, or namazu, in Japan. The most famous cultural association of the catfish was with earthquakes, reflected in common belief that seismic shock, which is a condition, of course, California shares with Japan, was generated by the motions of a giant subterranean catfish. And related to this, the idea that the active movements of catfish could predict earthquakes. And this generated a very interesting tradition in prints of catfish known as namazue, one of which you're seeing from the year 1855, when there was a very large earthquake known as the Ansei earthquake in Japan. Legends also abounded about certain catfish that were able to transform into dragons, becoming parables for the coming of age of boys as well as for spiritual transformation. Through these associations, the image of the catfish circulated widely in visual culture in forms ranging from craft motifs to parade floats. By the same token, the gourd, the fruit of the calabash tree, had many cultural associations in East Asia due to the fact that its hard outer shell, especially those that took their distinctive shape by being tied with a two-part mold when young, had many uses as bottles, containers, tools, toys, decorations, and even musical instruments. In China, it was also an ancient symbol associated with health because doctors would carry medicines inside it. And it was this association that led to the gourd serving as an attribute, a common attribute to Taoist immortals, as you see here, with related ideas of longevity. But perhaps an even more significant meaning in pictorial culture was the idea that the gourd was a magical container that bore no limits to what it could hold. Indeed, it could store the cosmos inside. It was the East Asian answer to the old comedian's line, "You can't have everything, where would you put it?" Well, you put it in the gourd. But these popular associations still do not help us understand the combination of the gourd and the catfish manifest in this painting. And in this regard, a recent literary analysis of the inscriptions by the scholar Yoshizawa Katsuhiro has shed considerable new light on the nature of this work. According to Yoshizawa, in Zen literature, both the gourd and the catfish are metaphors for the mind, which is the word I use to translate kokoro, the nature of which is inherently elusive to oneself, ultimately impossible to grasp. Although Yoshizawa's specific references are too numerous and complex to provide a detailed exposition here, suffice it to say that the mind itself was a primary source of contemplation in Zen thought and practice, as encapsulated in the following famous exchange between the Bodhidharma, the Chinese patriarch of Zen, and his disciple Hui Ke, the second patriarch. And it's a very simple exchange that you see here, where Huike, the disciple, approaches Bodhidharma and states, "My mind is anxious. Please pacify it." Bodhidharma replies, "Bring me your mind and I will pacify it." Eventually, Huike returns and says, "Although I've sought it, I cannot find it. There," Bodhidharma says, "I have pacified your mind." The mind was an illusory source of self and identity that prevented the practitioner from understanding the true nature of the non-self, one of the primary tenets of many forms of Buddhist thought, including Zen. According to this reading, the gourd and the catfish is about the impossibility of grasping the mind, symbolized by the catfish, with the mind, symbolized by the gourd, and by extension, about the absence of an independent and substantial self. But this is only recognizable as such by viewers steeped in Zen texts and classical Chinese literature in general. And in this regard, the preface by Shusu operates very much like a koan does, presenting an abstruse question or situation that tests the understanding of its Zen practicing audience, an understanding that is reflected in various ways in the 31 inscribed poems. This interpretation of the motifs in the gourd and the catfish, however, represents only a part of its profile and complexity. In what follows, I will address in turn the objecthood of the work as a screen, its composition, and its morphology to demonstrate further the ways in which the subject was embedded and performed. Now, the original format and site of the gourd and the catfish are crucial to understanding the way in which it not only pictorialized a Zen situation, but actually constituted a performance of said situation. Although now mounted as a vertical hanging scroll, what you see here on your left with the inscriptions above the painting, originally its painting and inscriptions were pasted on two sides of opposing sides of a standing screen, which is reconstructed just the front part here with the painting. As the preface tells us, the screen was installed to the right-hand side of the shogun Yoshimochi in what was believed to be the reception hall of his Muromachi palace in Kyoto. Now, unfortunately, Yoshimochi's palace is no longer standing, and only a few structures survive from Ashikaga palaces in any generation, such as the famous Togudo, or the Hall of Eastern Salvation that you see here, which is from the complex of the 8th shogun, Ashikaga Yoshimasa. Now, this is a very famous landmark in Kyoto, and it dates to the end of the 15th century, so some 70 years or so after the painting we've been looking at, The Gourd and the Catfish, was created. And we know something about the layout of the later shogunal compound, this one at the end of the 15th century, which is reconstructed here in this image. And the building that you see here, one of the large central buildings, was referred to as a kaisho, or reception room. And it was believed to be a similar hall in Yoshimochi's palace earlier in the 15th century that the gourd and the catfish was displayed. Now, I would submit that the original format of the painting as a standing screen enables two significant insights into its nature. The first is that by separately mounting the paintings and inscriptions onto the front and back of the screen, the format reinforces the dialogic nature of the work. If the task was presented on the recto side, the responses were recorded on its verso side. As a result, the koan-like progression of this work is presented that much more performatively and resonates with the actual profile of events that took place in the shogunal salon. The shogun Yoshimochi must have played a key role in the conception of this work. Yoshimochi was known as the medieval shogun with the greatest personal interest in Zen. And not only was he an avid student of Zen, but he was also known to paint works of Zen patriarchs and eccentrics on occasion. And I'm showing you here one famous example which survives in the Okayama Prefectural Museum. As a youth, Yoshimochi requested explanations from Zen monks concerning his own sobriquet, Kenzan, but also for specific koan, and he also was known to gather together prominent monks in order to have them discuss and respond to koan at his shogunal palace. Now, I should emphasize here that the inscription on the gourd and the catfish, the inscriptions on this painting, the gourd and the catfish, are most likely not recorded from a live gathering at the shogunal palace, but were solicited in the course of putting the screen together. However, in their structure, they somehow convey traces of a live group dynamic and thereby provide a theatrical dimension to the experience of the painting. The Gourd and the Catfish fashions its owner, Yoshimochi, as a man of Zen, and the theatrical nature of its performance was enhanced by its status as a screen. Although commonly overlooked, the physical presence of the screen is inseparable from the experience of viewing the picture on its surface. And this twin status of the screen as picture and pictorial object is really crucial to experiencing the work and has been theorized very compellingly by the art historian Wu Heng by recourse to an analogy with the twin operations in language of metaphor and metonymy, a set of operations that linguists have proposed as fundamental to understanding the operations of language. According to this idea, as a picture, a painted surface, the screen functions as a metaphor. That is to say, it establishes a similarity between two entities. When a screen is placed in any setting, it introduces a new meaning, a new semantics to its space through its picture. It introduces it to an otherwise neutral space. It animates that space with specific meaning, thereby establishing a similarity between the world of the painting and the actual space onto which the screen opens. On the other hand, as a piece of furniture that partitions actual space, the screen functions as a metonym. That is to say, it establishes a continuity as opposed to a similarity between two entities. Although as a partition, the screen separates its surroundings into distinct space cells, the partition itself is nevertheless necessary for the establishment of a series of neighboring spatial units that are contiguous within a sequence. In this manner, as painting an object, the screen is both metaphoric and metonymic vis-a-vis the space around it. Now, returning to the Gourd and the Catfish, we might say that metaphorically, this work structures the shogunal salon as a space of Zen, animating the chamber around it with the dialectical practices that were inseparable to the study of Zen koan. Metonymically, it embodies the communitas of Zen monks in the 5 mountains of Kyoto through its showcasing of the responses of so many of its leading monks. Aside from its physical objecthood, however, the Gourd and the Catfish stays as its subject through pictorial composition as well. And this is where I would like to move to a discussion of the third proposition offered tonight concerning its new mode. A consideration of its painter, Josetsu, in the composition of a figure in landscape are crucial to understanding what exactly was meant in the preface when it referred to the painting as being in this new mode. Now, little is known about the artist who created the work, the monk painter Josetsu. Until this era, Zen monk painters in Japan were generally low-ranking ecclesiasts in the circles of religious masters. Accordingly, we have very little information about Josetsu, and we don't even know his birth and death dates. Only a few works survive, and I'm showing you one of them here, which is a fan painting depicting a famous Chinese calligrapher, Wang Shizhe, inscribing fans within the painting, and this is currently in the Kyoto National Museum. We do know that Josetsu was active during the first 3 decades of the 15th century and was based at Shokokuji Monastery in Kyoto, which was the leading administrative Zen monastery with close ties to the shogunate. It also appears that Josetsu served as something of a painter in attendance to the Ashikaga shoguns, most likely receiving a stipend for his services. Indeed, later on, he would be championed as a patriarch in a lineage of monk painters associated with Shokokuji Temple and the Ashikaga shoguns. Now, Josetsu marks the increasingly active participation of monk painters in the shogunal sphere, and even the mention of his name in the preface marks a rise in the agency of the monk painter in Japan. Most important, however, is the role Josetsu played in mastering the new modes of Chinese painting that were being avidly collected by the Ashikaga shoguns and stored in their treasury. From the late 14th century onward, these paintings, some of which you see here, were being collected along with other continental luxury objects, ceramics, lacquerware, bronzes, textiles, and so forth, for display in shogunal palaces. This pattern of collecting emulated the material culture of Japanese Zen monasteries, which had close ties to China through the robust East Asian Zen macroculture, within which pilgrim monks frequently traveled from one country to another. Ashikaga collecting shifted the display context of these objects to a secular setting. And I'm showing you here a collecting manual which is believed to record some display practices associated with the shogunal palaces, specifically for the display of Chinese luxury objects. But it was also clear that the shoguns modeled their cultural activities after Chinese emperors. And the third Ashikaga shogun, Yoshimitsu, pressed his owner's seals on Chinese paintings, in emulation of Chinese imperial practice. And in later generations, shoguns would avidly collect painters active in the Sung Imperial Painting Academy. Josetsu was the first monk painter in Japan to begin basing his painting upon the habits of representation of Chinese works in the Ashikaga collection through modes, the adoption of pictorial modes. Although it is unclear whether or not the new mode mentioned in the preface refers to a specific Chinese style, scholars have cited Liang Kai, a Chinese academic painter active in the early 13th century, as a possible inspiration for Josetsu, based on the highly agitated, choppy, short brushstrokes used to delineate the clothing by both painters. I'm showing you a comparison here between the protagonist of The Gourd and the Catfish and a work by Liang Kai, which is titled The Sixth Patriarch, tearing a sutra, a very typical kind of antinomian, iconoclastic Zen subject. But I would emphasize even more the new compositional template of figure in landscape as specifically pictorial means of staging Zen awakening. Until this period, Japanese Zen figure painting consisted primarily of figures against a blank background or a minimally filled one, as you see here in an earlier 14th century work of the shrimp eater, which you can see is very minimally, very, very abbreviated landscape elements. The Gourd and the Catfish, however, as abbreviated as it might seem, is comparatively more sophisticated, mobilizing composition, wash, brushwork, and the careful placement of motifs to generate pictorial meaning. In this regard, it follows a pattern established by Chinese painters of the Imperial Academy, such as Ma Yuan, who here depicts the Chinese monk Dongshan achieving awakening while fording a stream, in keeping with a very famous anecdote or episode about the master. The scenography of the work and the visual conceit of a figure in transit lends itself well to the inscription of unanticipated epiphanic moments, insights that arrive as the figure is immersed in some other activity. Now, the aforementioned Liang Kai, a Chinese painter of the 13th century, also adopted this compositional format in a very famous work known as Shakyamuni's Descent, which depicts Shakyamuni, the historical Buddha, descending from a mountain after 6 years of ascetic practice. Now, normally the Buddha's enlightenment is understood to have taken place under the Bodhi tree, which is the scene after this one where he descends the mountain and goes next. But in Zen Buddhism, this moment was dislocated to that of his descent from the mountain when it was least expected. The visual interest of a painting like this stems from the tension between the haggard Buddha in a hunched, heavy stance, paused warily in a kind of pictorial caesura, and the idea that it was precisely during this transitional moment that the Buddha gains insight, that it is here amidst the seeming iconography of defeat that Buddhism begins. Similarly, the composition of the Gourd and the Catfish enables the inscription of insight onto this figure. It adopts the schema of Chinese Sung period Imperial Academy painting, in this case the so-called one-corner composition of landscape depiction, in order to provide a pictorial setting for a Zen Enlightenment narrative. And in Japan, it's no exaggeration to say that such a work would not have been possible until this moment, when the most advanced pictorial techniques of the day were being mastered in the shogunal and Zen spheres. Here, the figure standing at its center is not in transit, but immersed in the task at hand, full of concentration. His activity becomes the pretext for expositions into the elusive nature of the mind in Buddhist thought, as witnessed in the poetic inscriptions. But the implication is that the figure himself, a simpleton seemingly mired in the mundane world, will also achieve wisdom, will also be the subject of epiphanic satori, precisely because he is otherwise engaged, in a position to be caught off guard. The gourd and the catfish offers in this way a new type of mise en scène of the awakened subject. It conveys a form of spiritual capture, of Zen enlightenment at the moment of its happening. The final component of the gourd and the catfish I'd like to call attention to concerns its morphology. A close examination of its formal qualities beyond the composition demonstrates how the picture itself proposes a way of expressing, if not explaining or understanding, the concept of mind or no mind in Zen Buddhism. Now, I've already discussed how Zen texts provide precedents for understanding how both the gourd and the catfish serve as metaphors of the mind, and thus the idea that attempting to capture or pin a catfish with a gourd is an allegorical expression of the elusiveness of the mind itself. This mutualism of the gourd and the catfish is reflected in the fact that their curving, undulating outlines parallel one another. Indeed, the wavy silhouettes that characterize both of the primary motifs here seem to serve as a visual expression of the ungraspable slipperiness of their essence. This quality in particular is emphasized in the verse inscriptions, which make abundant recourse to onomatopoeic sounds to describe their subjects. Thus, there are kind of echo-mimetic sequences in the poetry, such as for the gourd, koro-koro, roko-roko, and roku-roku. And for the catfish, sounds that convey the slipperiness of the creature, hatsu-hatsu, neba-neba, and nuru-nuru. The undulating bends of the twin motifs might be said to serve as a visual analog of these sequences of sounds. A closer look at the gourd and the catfish, however, suggests that this sinusoidal curve that we find in the catfish and the gourd serves as a structuring device for the picture as a whole. It is apparent in the stalks of bamboo, especially the middle and right ones that sway and bend in the air. It is apparent in the stream, the flow of water, and even the mountains in the background. But it is perhaps most conspicuous in the foreground embankment. Here, the curve takes on a rather flamboyant profile, appearing as a scratchy, inky, calligraphic set of lines that stand out in relation to the otherwise subdued brushwork of the remainder of the scene. These visual rhymes that suffuse the painting suggest a way of conceptualizing the task posed by the preface, that there is somehow an equivalence among all things in the world. The mind, or kokoro, in this regard is not reducible to an individual subject or psyche, but is exteriorized onto the landscape. One might understand this as a ubiquity of mind, or its absence as a unified subjective entity. However this is formulated, this understanding is inscribed into the image through the resonant morphology of its motifs. And this indeed is where I would locate one of the primary achievements of this painting. It takes advantage of the most advanced artistic techniques of its era to elaborate a pictorial ground for Zen discourse, while at the same time manifesting that same discourse in the form of a master curve that perpetuates itself like an algorithm, echoing throughout the picture, throughout the pictorial space. The result is a remarkable mindscape, or if one accepts that this entity is too diffuse and elusive to conceptualize, then a scene of no mind or mindlessness, a neverland of the mind. One of the most notable aspects of the legacy of the gourd and the catfish was that in Japan, nothing like it was ever painted again. Perhaps in its expression of a Zen koan in the form of a painting and inscriptions, its mounting as a screen for the shogunal palace, its adoption of a compositional schema that allowed for the staging of Zen narratives, and its formulation of a uniquely pictorial way of expressing the imponderability of mind, it was simply too complex an artifact to become the basis for future artworks. Perhaps it was too closely tied to the will of the shogun, Yoshimochi, the most ardent and knowledgeable of Zen practitioners among all medieval shoguns. Perhaps it was due to the rise of pure landscape in the following generations among monk painters in the 15th century, which was predicated upon a projective aesthetics, excuse me, in which viewers projected themselves into and onto an otherwise neutral setting, a highly different representational dynamic from what we have just witnessed. Whatever the case may be, the gourd in the catfish embodies a unique and short-lived relationship between painting and Zen meaning. In the following generations, paintings would continue to complement the world of Zen thought and practice, but formulate its inquiries in very different ways, including the exploration of the liquidity of ink painting and its kind of myriad semi-accidental effects to manifest ideas about the ineffable quality of the Buddha nature residing in all sentient things, as witnessed in works such as Sesshu Toyo's splashed ink landscape, which you see to the right, dated to 1495, and Tawaraya Sotatsu's bowls of the early 17th century, which you see on the left here. But these are subjects for another lecture at another time. Thank you very much.
So Professor Lippit will take some questions.
One of the questions is, when did it change from a painting and then everything on the reverse to being all on the front?
That's a very good question, which is difficult to answer because we've only really we only really know that it was originally mounted as a screen from the preface itself, which states explicitly that it was mounted as a small screen, a standing screen. And there's physical evidence from the work itself that there were two, the inscriptions and the paintings were originally separate. But it must have, its fate as a painting format must have been tied to the fortunes of the building in which it was kept. And Muromachi palaces had a very short shelf life. They were timber frame structures which needed to be, really kept up every generation. And there was just the ravages of war in 15th century Kyoto made sure that this palace didn't. So what's interesting is that actually the painting then moved into a Zen monastery known as Myoshinji, which originally had no real close relationship with the Ashikaga shogunate. And so there must have been a period when it was kind of circulating around many different collections. And over time it came to assume the hanging scroll format. And hanging scrolls are very easy to preserve and transport. They roll up into cylinders and can be placed in very small boxes and easily stored. And so it's a much more mobile format than the standing screen.
Okay. One of the other questions I had was, thank you for that. One of the monks said that it's something about changing from a frog to a prince. Was that actually a phrase used then? I mean...
Not quite.
Okay, all right, because I thought we use that now.
Translator's license.
Okay.
But what it refers to is the notion that, which was also shared with carp, that the catfish that successfully swam upstream, made it all the way up to the mouth of the river, of the waterway, would be able to transform into a dragon, the very rare catfish or carp. And that, so that became the, especially the carp swimming upstream became a kind of a symbol for an auspicious image for the coming of age of boys. And by extension, spiritual transformation. So that's actually a phrase that you see very commonly in Zen poetry. And so here, in order to capture the flavor of that, it was the frog turning into a prince, but it's really the catfish turning into a dragon.
Thank you so much.
Hi, thank you so much for the very interesting talk. I wonder if you've thought at all about the practical aspects of the artist painting a fish in water, in movement, beneath a surface, and that whether these practical difficulties of painting specifically the fish would be one of the reasons why they're so attractive to these Zen issues in these Zen painters?
Yes, well, I would answer that in several ways. One is that the catfish has a long life outside of painting, and you might even say before painting, as a rich kind of multivalent symbol in, among other things, Buddhist discourse. It was so the specific choice of painting a fish here wouldn't necessarily be the artists or the monk painters. It would be an assignment, but. That said, you know, there is the tradition that this is beginning to base itself on of Imperial Academy painting in China, which was one of the highest artistic centers in East Asia associated with the Chinese Imperium, whose works were collected by Ashikaga shoguns in Japan, and which became the basis for pictorial modes, such as this one, was very interested in naturalistic depiction. And there is in fact a genre of painting of fish seen swimming in water and through water. And so the artistic problem of conveying a fish swimming in water, which is still available to vision, accessible to the viewer, but you still somehow experience it in the watery medium, in the kind of, you know, aqueous ether, was a big zone of attention for artists. So they would develop all kinds of techniques using water-based transparent blue pigment to depict the water, to posit the water as a surface, but to allow the viewer to see through it to the fish swimming beneath. And so it was that's not quite mastered here. This is a little more schematic, and what I would argue is that the more important aspect of the rendering of the catfish is the kind of master curve that it manifests, that from which the entire painting springs or is made possible. This kind of, you know, that's kind of rhizomically perpetuates itself in the curve of the various curves of the landscape.
Just in terms of its location next to the right of the shogun, is it possible that where the scroll was placed was sort of maybe a humorous kind of joke by the shogun saying the fish and the gourd are symbols of mind and grasping it? Maybe he was saying we meet here so we might be able to comprehend our own minds and understand one another.
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
Sure. With your earlier comment with Zen mythology and the gourd and the catfish being symbols of the mind and understanding it, do you think by its location in the meeting place of the shogun's palace, he might have made a small gesture or a joke to his visitor saying, we meet in this building because we're trying to understand our own minds?
This has the potential to become a very koan-like exchange in its own right. And you know, if I could fully respond to that question, I would be the abbot of Shokokuji Temple without a doubt. But I think it's a big question. What the you know, what the tone or mood or tenor of the work is, and that's a big question in Zen koans themselves, which are oftentimes perceived as humorous and are, and as you can tell from the inscriptions by the Zen monks, they treat it in a kind of humorous or irreverent way, and I think there are shades of gray here that are very important to understanding the kind of the specific dispositions of each inscriber. But they're somehow humorous and serious at the same time. And as for the intentions of creating this, it's, I think the status of this object of a screen, I think when you place it as a screen in a room, as the discussion by the art historian Wu Heng suggests, it does animate that room with a certain sense. Now, you know, it could be that was something that was a backdrop, a scenography for new kinds of Zen performances, that it recorded one set of poetic inscriptions or responses, but that there were future discussions about Zen themes that were meant to take place in front of the screen. So there were other screens that could, bird and flower screens or paradisal screens that could animate the room with different moods for different occasions. The display of paintings, I think, was occasion specific, but this may have been something that was used to structure some kind of discussion of Zen, and we know from records that that was something that the shogun that characterized the salon of the shogun Yoshimochi. So.
One last question? No? Then let's thank
There's one
again.
person.
No. Okay. Then let's thank again. Oh, wonderful.